Welcome to the Right Side Up podcast with your hosts Danielle Strickland and James Scholl. This season is Need to Know, everything we want to tell Christian leaders about the future of the church and how empowering women is mission critical to a flourishing future. The book Need to Know will be available October 11th, but to get us started, we have many of the 21 authors to talk about the flourishing present, the flourishing future, and all things need to know. We are glad you are here.
Okay, welcome everybody to The Right Side Up with your hosts, James Scholl and Danielle Strickland. That's me. And we are blessed this episode to have Scot McKnight in the house. Scot is a beloved theologian and author of mine. Anyway, I remember Scot many years ago, the blue parakeet rocking my world, and delightfully surprised to find the exegesis example of women in there, kind of slid in there very subversively, like a good Jesus follower would. And then more recently, of course, we've touched base several times over a church called Tove and Pivot, and just this prophetic biblical calling to what is going on with the church, and how can we be people that look and reflect the nature of Jesus. This Need to Know compilation, you contributed to a chapter, and it's kind of fun. So Need to Know, in case everyone is not already know, it's a compilation, 21 different diverse authors. Scot is one of 3 men that are trusted enough to give us some voice in this space, but really a need to know to all the male leaders of the church about the future of the church and how the empowerment and partnership with women are central to its flourishing. And Scot, you wrote a chapter in this book. It's in the section on the image of God and how we do this together. And you wrote about Mary.
Yes, mother of Jesus. Yeah. And
I have a friend who calls Mary the Catholic boogeyman. You know, she comes out once a year at Christmas and goes, boo. And all the Protestants go, ah.
Yeah. Oh, that's,
Yeah.
I tell a different story. I say, we unwrap her and put her in Christmas crushes. And then on January 1st, we wrap her back up, pat her on the bottom, and tell her to go away till the next year. And that's, Danielle, I can't tell you the number of pastors that I've talked to over the years that I've asked, have you ever preached about Mary? And they've said no. I mean, it's right there.
It's quite a lot, especially as you say in Luke's gospel that you talk about a lot. Mike, if you're not, you really are just neglecting quite a lot of the New Testament if you're not talking about her.
She's there more than most people realize. And of course, Jesus gets prime billing in the Gospels, and Peter would be number 2 probably. But Mary gets as many episodes, separable episodes, as Peter, although Peter gets to be involved in things. And then most people forget that she's in Acts chapter 1. She's in the Pentecostal community, and she probably doesn't just disappear from Jerusalem at that time. And I believe this is a stunning observation. I don't believe it's in the chapter. I talk about Mary, Danielle, and James so often that I don't always know what I've written about her, but I do know what I talk about. In Revelation chapter 12, there's it's the story of the woman and the dragon. And when you first start reading the beginning of chapter 12, it's got to be Mary. Only Mary is the woman who gave birth to a son who is Jesus. And now that woman morphs. She could be Israel, she could be Mary, she could be the church. So there's some morphing that goes on, which is okay for John. But we just seem to ignore her. And I have read many commentaries on Revelation chapter 12, and only Catholics and the Orthodox see Mary in Revelation 12, and Protestants don't even mention her. It's not even a possibility. And you can't read Revelation 12:1 and 12:1 through 3 and not think that could be Mary. So,
Scott, I think that's one. I love that you just were like, let's just talk about Mary,
yeah,
because us not talking about Mary is a great example of how we've erased women from the narrative,
yes,
not
yes,
just like in the biblical witness, of course, but also just in how easy it is to do that in our Christian history. And you're in that chapter where we talk about the erasure of women leaders and disciples and early apostolic influences and theologians. And this is just such a pressing example. I mean, this text that we all hold sacred and inspired and divine, we're not even being faithful to it when we
yeah.
erase Mary, because Mary is intentionally written in there. I mean, like James just said, you would literally have to not follow the biblical text to not include Mary. I mean, it's so to
And how
have,
many,
you know, to have, yeah,
how
yeah.
many of us have heard a series of sermons on women in the early church or women in the Old Testament? I mean, really, I mean, there's a lot of women. I remember one time lecturing to undergraduate students, and I talked about Phoebe in Romans 16, chapters 1 and 2. Pretty significant woman. And when I left the class, there was a woman waiting in the classroom at the back, and I thought, okay, I'm leaving out the front. Okay, you can stay here by yourself. So I start walking, and she starts following me, but an uncomfortable distance. But I felt like she was following me, and she followed me all the way across campus, across the bridge, and then I went up to my office, up some stairs, and I heard someone coming up the steps after her, and there she was. She appears at my door. She sits down and she says to me, I'll quote her exactly. "I am so pissed," she said. "I grew up in the church and I have never heard about Phoebe. Why?" Now she's a pastor today. So this silencing of women is a characteristic of church ministry over the years. And I think the only way to undo it is to give them voices and to bring them forward. Just exactly what you're doing in this book, Danielle, is bringing out these women's voices. And a new book came out by, at least one of the editors was a Canadian, Canadian, Marianne Ann Taylor, and her friend Joyce Schrader on Voices Long Silenced. And I got to tell you,
I have that book. It's in my house.
I read that book, and I was stunned by the number of women I had never heard of.
Yeah.
I was stunned. And I like to think that I know this topic. And it was just one page after another. And it was not an exciting book. It was very textbookish, encyclopedic type descriptions of people and when they lived and their dates. And it was a good narrative, but you had to work at it. But I was stunned by the number of women that I had never heard of. And it was so encouraging to hear that there were far more than I ever knew about. And I hope to help bring them forward.
Yeah, that's great. I remember in the Blue Parakeet, I remember at the very end, and this is like when I first heard of you, I literally just picked that up on my own, like exegetical, how to read the Bible, and then was surprised that there was this thing in there. But you mentioned you apologize in that book. And that was the other thing that really endeared me to you as a man of character and humility, to say, like, I apologize to students I guess you came from an agreement with a theological understanding of women, or maybe you just didn't deal with it head on. Can you remind me of that?
Yeah.
This is ancient history. This is a long journey, but can you talk to me a little bit about how you changed your view and how that matters now?
It's been a while since I read that book myself. I grew up in a complementarian type world. My mother and father were. My mother would have called herself a complementarian if she'd have known about the word, but she didn't behave that way. She was very much competitive, aggressive. She made things happen if she found resources to make. She was the leader in our church, choir director. but she adapted to the role. And my father was a leader type, and but I would not have ever heard any kind of language about submission. So it was pretty natural for me to grow up into an evangelical world, and at the time was very much complementarian, though not using that term. When when Pat Gundry wrote her famous book, and Stan Gundry got fired at Zondervan, I was kind of stunned. I thought, wow, this is a polemical issue. And here I'm teaching at Trinity, a seminary that is pretty complementarian, but it was not a hot topic. It didn't come up in classes. I had women students who complained, and I gave them voice and encouraged them. And I wanted to support women, but frankly, I was involved in other things. And I had other academic projects. I wasn't involved in that kind of battle. And I had a colleague across the hallway that was Wayne Grudem. And he was very much into this issue. And after a while, we often rode to school together. So, but at one point I said, I'm going to push for this one. And I began to push a little bit harder. And then I left Trinity and started teaching at North Park. And it was just wonderful. I had so many women students, young women students, who were gifted and who had absolute confidence that they could lead and be pastors and senior pastors like anybody else. And it was a wonderful naivete that they didn't realize what kind of battle they were going to fight or face. And so for a long time I've done that, but I was not anywhere near as forward and affirming as I could have been. And now I look back, I wish I had been, and maybe I should have been. I mean, I never pushed against women in ministry at all in all those early years teaching at a seminary. But I think I could have pushed harder. Probably would have never gotten tenure. But that's the way. May have just been enough to offend people.
Well, Scott, thanks for saying so. The reason I'm asking is because we're really hoping that some men and male leaders will read this book. Mm-hmm. And I think I've come across a lot of men in this season, and I feel like some of the abuse that has been exposed in the church has revealed the inevitable direction, like the fruit of the direction of not advocating for women.
Yeah.
So the passivity. So I've had some men in the season come to me and say, this has never been my issue. I'm for you, like I'm for women, but I don't know what to do. And I wonder if you had some advice to them. What would you have done differently if you could? What would you advise younger, male leaders in a patriarchal world, whether even male leaders that are convinced theologically that this is a good thing? But what would you say? What would be the things that you would say to do intentionally?
Yeah. I just got a letter today from a young woman who is bothered by a church denomination that allows women to be ordained at certain level, but they can't move to the upper levels of the denomination. Why? If it's okay here, what's wrong? All right. So I get this question. A couple things. If I had to do over, I would have had only women graduate assistants, TAs, when I was at Trinity. When I was at North Park, I hired my own TAs because North Park didn't provide this kind of thing. Eventually they did. And they were all women. At Northern, when I was teaching there, I had, I think, 2 women TAs and 2 men. And it wasn't like I was aggressive about it would be only women, but I tried to find women that I thought could benefit from the experience of working like this and give them some exposure at the institution and give them confidence in their giftedness. So I would say the first thing is to move over on the platform, whatever platform we have, men, especially white men, We need to move over and get replaced in some moments, and sometimes in certain situations, by women. The second thing is we need to work very hard that our power boards, the power groups in the institution, have at least a 50% representation of women. Danielle, what I've learned is it's different when women are in the room. And what I've learned is when my classrooms have, let's say, if there's 30% in a classroom that's women, the dynamic is completely different. If it's 5%, 2 students out of 25, it's not the same. But when women have other women around, they can feel empowered enough to talk and know that they don't have to worry about these men silencing them, because there's going to be women who say, yeah, sister. So provide opportunities for women to feel empowered by providing opportunities where women can be in positions of leadership, power, whatever you want to call it, representation, and they're not alone. When they're alone, they can feel like a token. And when they're alone, they can feel like this is a good old boys club. This is a men's room. I can't do what I want to do. But give women enough critical mass and they will feel empowered. And when they're empowered, the dynamic in the room changes and the content changes. I support that. I would support academic leadership, deans, presidents being women. I've been told that women struggle raising money from wealthy men more than men do. That might be true. I don't know that we've given women enough opportunity. But I would just say we have to move over and we have to create a different culture. But the other thing that I have consciously done, and my wife drills me every time this doesn't happen, and that is when I preach a sermon or when I write a chapter for my everyday Bible studies, I do everything I can to make sure some woman is quoted or some story about a woman is told. I have found the challenge in finding these stories. It's a lot easier to find stories about men than it is about women, which leads me to a story. So when I wrote the chapter on Mary in the Jesus Creed, I decided that every illustration in the chapter would be about women. So I get a phone call from a former student who's in a conservative evangelical denomination leadership position, and a good position. And he says, I loved your Jesus Creed book. He said, but I really had trouble with the Mary chapter. And I said, what was the problem? He said, every story was about a woman and I couldn't relate. And I said, Greg, that's how women feel every Sunday morning in your sermons. And he couldn't figure out what I meant. I said, Greg, you're probably only telling stories about men. And that's so I have collected over the years books that have stories about women that I can try to use in my books. And every time I write one of these everyday Bible studies, I make sure one of the primary books that I read is a commentary by a woman. It makes a difference.
Yeah, I love that. And the thing that strikes me so beautifully about all of the things that you've said is the intention. Nothing will change the stasis. Nothing will change the status quo without direct, intentional action to do something different. Yeah. So the system is perfectly designed to produce whatever it produces. So if there's a lack of women's stories, if there's a lack of women on boards, if there's a lack of women leaders, then that system that has created that lack is perfectly designed to keep creating that lack. So unless there's something that intentionally changes, nothing will ever change. It's not like hope, And what I love about what you shared, Scott, too, is it's not until you get intentional about a decision that you make. So I'm going to include women's stories in every preach. Then you start going, oh gosh, there's not a lot of women's stories out there. And that's when you start realizing, oh wow, this is like a legit, plight. This is a real, genuine, the erasure of women's stories, the not telling, the passivity around it. I mean, it's just fascinating to me. I think Mary's song, you don't mention this in your chapter, but I think Mary's song, that passage of scripture, has been banned in multiple countries from being read out loud. Is that, am I
Well, one of
making?
Well,
the
yeah, I've got a story about this one.
Yeah,
I like stories.
great.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I heard about this, and so I contacted. I tried to contact priests, Roman Catholic priests. I found a priest who had been in Nicaragua. I think it's Nicaragua. When the Magnificat was banned in daily recitation in monasteries and, for women as well. And he told me that this happened. He says, yes, I remember when it happened. So I have it in my Mary book. I have a little book on Mary. I have it in the Mary book. But when I tried to publish when I wrote an article for Christianity Today, they wouldn't allow me to include that story because
Wow.
they couldn't confirm it with 2 or 3 sources. I said, do you suppose that Noriega, I think it was Noriega, right? Do you suppose that he published this so that everybody could read it in the whole world? No, this was inside. I said, I've got a priest who was there. He can tell you that this happened. Well, we need 2. I said, well, I don't have to. So they wiped it out of the story. But I've heard this, that the Magnificat has been banned at times because of its political subversiveness. And it is politically subversive.
I believe in it was taken out of the Anglican lectionary in India. And Justin Welby tells the story, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury. Yeah, so during the kind of colonization of India, which was not the greatest of times, they obviously had to be a little bit more selective about what they read out. And weirdly, the idea of tearing down the mighty wasn't something that they... So yeah, they just removed this part because it's such a subversive... The last time I preached on it, I just said, so this is the greatest song ever written. No, that's not up for debate. and now let's talk about it. Now, something that fascinated me in the chapter, Scott, and I love that we're talking about this in the way that we are, is you point out how Mary in this song says, like, generations will call me blessed. And you're like, not really. Like, generations will write me out of the story, maybe, but as far as calling me blessed, way less so, actually. But again, even the elevation of the lowly that we see in that song, something you point out that I missed because I haven't read a proper standard version recently, is you use the translation impoverished slave for how she refers to herself, which is a lot more accurate to the Greek translation, whereas stuff like the King James Bible uses a much more elegant, like, he's regarded the lower state of his handmaiden. It's like, no, like, she's real about this, she is raw about this, and this is the person we should be listening to.
Yeah, this is the term is referring to someone who has been humiliated in impoverishment. And the English translations are very genteel in wanting to translate the Greek word doulos, which means slave. They want to translate that as servant because it's gentler. But there's quite a few translations today. I know my own, I was consistent on this. Quite a few translations now are saying we need to translate this as slave or enslaved person. So yeah, she's predicting in the past tense, as it were, that Herod is coming down and her baby boy is going to be on the throne. And that is subversive, and it's resistant. It's a dissident perspective. And this is a young woman in Galilee with a lot of courage. And over the years, we've spent quite a bit of time in Italy. And if you're in Italy, you go to the Duomo, you go to the local churches. And I always want to see the pictures, the paintings of Mary. One of my artist friends says, you can't call these things pictures, Scott. These are pieces of art. So I always look at the paintings of Mary, and she's always pious, with a little bit of rose tint on her cheeks, like she's had some makeup, or she's a little bit embarrassed about being in public, But she looks very pious and pensive. And when I look at the gospel records about Mary, I don't see that kind of character at all. I think she was in the middle of the action and the first person who got out of line. She was willing to speak for justice and stand in the gap. And I think we need to have different artwork. I've had some Catholics tell me that I'm wrong and I need to quit saying these things. And I think, no, I'm going to keep. It's in your Bible, I said.
Have you?
She's courageous.
Have you seen the image by Ben Wildflowers? And it's "Cast down the mighty, send the rich away," and it's Mary. So if you're listening to this podcast, maybe we can share the link. But it says, "Fill the hungry, lift the lowly, cast down the mighty," and it's Mary with a fist in the air, with a foot on a skull and on a snake. So it's this defiant image. It may have even been a wood cutting, actually. But yeah, it's this wonderful image. We'll share it with you. But
I think
that's the best one. That's the best one. That's the best one.
Well, what I loved too about the chapter is how you emphasized, and I mean, well, you just revealed that it's obvious that Jesus in his first manifesto has been deeply impressed, as all kids are, by his mom.
Yeah.
And you see this theology, which is very prophetic and a huge part of the announcement of this good news that's coming into the world. And then Jesus echoing that same announcement a few chapters later in his own manifesto of ministry. So,
okay, we've kicked off a season called Need to Know. And the reason we've done that is it is in conjunction with Need to Know the book. Now, there is a website you're going to need to know, which is need-to-know-book.com. A lot of dashes, need-to-know-book.com. The link will be in the show notes. And this is where all the things will be. Get this book into the hands of every leader that you know, because this is need to know for every Christian leader about the future of the church and how the empowerment of women are a big part of that. So go there, read this stuff, write the reviews, and spread the word and help us get this out. There's really no use. And actually, I'm a little bit tired of talking about this stuff, but it not being heard by the people that need to hear it the most. So we need help. So if you'd like to join our launch team, you can go to the website and just press launch team and join us. There's lots of perks in there, but also a great company of people who want to spread good news everywhere. The other key area that you could help us, and I'm very excited about this, is there's an ally section. Allies. Now, men come to me all the time these days and say, I am all for this. I think it's essential conversation. I think it's an essential practice, but I don't know what to do. Well, here you go, guys. Here's something that you could actually do. Be an ally. And there's an ally section. What the allies will do is use the book as a resource. So start book studies locally or on your web platforms. Highlight in whatever way you have, either in your pulpit or in your Bible study or your home group or on your podcast, a couple of authors in the book, a couple contributors, which there are 21. So there's a plethora of experts on various topics. And then just genuinely stand in solidarity that this is something that needs to change for the future of the church. So if that's you, please ally. Now, you don't have to be a guy to be an ally, but boy, that would be good. So we have a good start, but I would love there to be 500 allies. I mean, why not? And it is time, actually. Women can't just from the outside keep, shouting. I mean, we will, but we can't keep shouting. We actually need allies who will help us get this message out and embed it, get it in to the cultures and to the system. So anyway, this is what we're calling you to, but launch team, please help us. And allies, we need you. Need-to-know-book.com. Now's the time.
And again, the erasing of Mary and Mary's words from the scripture really minimizes then Jesus's words.
Yeah.
Which I think is the problem. If you erase women from all the text, but especially Mary, you erase her from the text, you've really diminished and erased part of what it is that Jesus is embodying.
Yeah, and maybe given him credit for something he got from his mom.
Mm.
I mean, if you read I gave a lecture one time, and this was amazing because I didn't know I was supposed to give a lecture. I was at a school. All of a sudden, the guy says, "Oh, you're going to teach this class." I said, I don't know anything about that. What am I supposed to? He says, it's on Luke. Do whatever you want. So I said, okay. So I start with the Magnificat and look at the themes of the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1. And then I go to the episode of Jesus in his first sermon in Nazareth in Luke 4:16. And then we go to the Beatitudes in Luke chapter 6. And then we go in Luke chapter 7 to John the Baptist and Jesus. John's in prison, and Jesus says, this is what I'm doing. And all these passages echo what Mary said was going to happen with Jesus. And then, of course, you have to skip ahead to Acts chapter 1, where you get Mary present. And in Acts chapter 2, all of a sudden, all these themes of economic justice come into play in the new community. And, I think in the chapter, I said the hand that rocks the cradle rocks the world, and the hand that rocked Jesus, rocked him into thinking about these songs. And I know it's guesswork, but we have to live with some of our own guesswork, and I've chosen to live with this one. I think Mary sang this song to Jesus as a boy, and to the other kids in the family. And Jesus' brother James can say that pure religion, undefiled, is to take care of widows and orphans. Well, his mother was a widow, probably, and an orphan in Judaism was anyone who had lost one parent, not both. So James is an orphan. Jesus was an orphan, probably, from a teenage on. We don't know when Joseph disappears, but he's gone by the time he's there at 12, and after that we don't see him again. I believe that Mary had a huge impact on Jesus, and that he learned from her. And we're wrong if we think Jesus didn't learn from people. We're wronger if we think he didn't learn from his mother. And her piety, her vision of what God was going to do, which she gets from prophetic inspiration, from angelic visitation, is a vision of economic justice and justice for the poor and food and drink. And, this is a vision of revolution against the system. Mm-hmm. So she was defiant.
And you're even from, you were saying what Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. So people say, well, did Jesus just have God sort of downloaded into him when he was born? Yeah. Like what happened there? Well, scripture tells us he grew in wisdom and stature. What's fascinating is the verse immediately before that says his mother treasured all the things in her heart. So it's even like saying Mary treasured what people said about Jesus and who she knew Jesus would be. And then Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. Maybe there's a connection between those two verses that follow one another.
I love that she treasured. Mary knew. She knew things that were supposed to come out. She knew a script for Jesus. And she lived, one of my friends, a Messianic Jew, says she was a Jewish mother. And she had that Yiddish accent from New York City, I guess, which they don't have in Israel. But she had a vision for what this boy was supposed to do. And she butts in at times, in John chapter 2 in the wedding in Cana. She comes to Jesus. They've run out of wine. And Jesus kind of pushes back and says, well, it's not my time. Too bad. And then every Roman Catholic will tell you this. He did exactly what she asked. So she becomes a mediator. But she, at one point, Mark tells us that he thinks that the family thinks Jesus has lost his mind in Mark 3:20 and 21. And then they leave Nazareth and walk down to Capernaum, which is 2 or 3 day walk. I mean, I'm sure the first century people could walk pretty far and not too worried about the heat. And they get down there and they sort of knock on the door. I think it's Peter's house. Have you been, Danielle? Have you been to Capernaum?
Yeah.
So you've seen the complex there.
Yeah.
I think that's probably right. So they knock on the door, and Jesus pretty much pushes back and says, they say your mother and brothers and sisters are at the door. Who's my mother? Who's my brother? Who's my sister? People who are sitting around, that's my mother. So he's sort of inviting her, but she's got the courage, in a sense, to get on the hoof and get down there to Capernaum and say, Jesus, these people are really getting mad about you, and you need to be careful. If you're not careful, they're going to kill you. And, I think Jesus could have said, that might be in the script too. So she reads a script that expects Jesus to be the Messiah ruler in Jerusalem, and she's going to be whispering sweet directions from behind the throne, but Jesus has to push back. So he has a different vision, but it has the same ultimate result. So Mary has the courage to get in the way of Jesus and correct him when she thinks he's wrong. Pretty good.
I mean, it's the answer to that dumb every Christmas carol that says, Mary, did you know? The answer is yes, read your Bible. She knew. She knew more than you do. The other thing I love is that not only to dismiss Mary is to really diminish Jesus and diminish that relationship and diminish the way that Jesus emerges on the scene. But also, I think Mary is the first prototype of a Christian. Mary is the first person who bears Christ and dies to herself and says yes to the will of God, surrenders fully, and who follows Jesus. And again, that's that evidence in Acts that she becomes one of the witnesses of the early church and one of the great company of witnesses there. So I feel like I'm filled with the Holy Spirit, all the things. So I feel like also we miss this like prototype of what it means to be invited to bear Christ in our lives and to be fully, I even think without a woman helping men understand the full surrender of pregnancy. I did a whole sermon on just how much I hated being pregnant. And I know you're not supposed to say that as a woman. It's supposed to be a great delight. But one of the things I hated about it was that I lost control over my body. I was no longer in charge of my body. This thing I hadn't met yet, this person that I loved but I didn't know yet, was taking over, sapping my energy, taking over all of my and I had no physical control over what my body looked like anymore. It was just fully, and what it did was it pushed back against all my autonomy, all my sense of self, all my pride, all these things. And I was like, geez, what it's doing is it's making love primary and my own ego, status, control, body secondary, because that's the way of love, which is, of course, the way of discipleship. And if you don't have a woman to help you understand what bearing life means, what bearing Christ is, you'll miss it as a man. You won't understand what it means to be fully surrendered and given over to the purposes of God, unless you've fully surrendered and given over yourself to somebody else.
I mean, it's an excellent illustration about which I know nothing.
Well, and that was when I got done preaching. This is a pretty egalitarian church. I got done preaching, and I'm telling you, the overwhelming response was, I have never heard a message on bearing Christ as discipleship. And again, we miss it because we miss Mary, mostly, I guess, because it's such a male-dominated space, the platform. So you're missing the voice of a woman to help you understand why God might have picked birth and a woman to birth Christ as a prototype of what it means to bear Christ in the world, Yeah.
The story of Mary, to me, is the prototypical story of what it was like to be a first century Jew and to embrace Jesus as the Messiah. Now, when I say Jesus as the Messiah, that's so Christian. It sounds, but the Jesus of Galilee did not fulfill the script of Judaism. So to accept him as the Messiah was to accept a radically alternative understanding of Messiah. So Mary and Joseph, Danielle, you understand this in ways men cannot understand. Mary is pregnant before she's married.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a woman experiences shame in the Jewish world for pregnancy like this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably one of the reasons why she went to visit Elizabeth in the hill country.
Mm-hmm.
But she begins by saying yes to the angel. She begins to bear the cross before Jesus is even born.
Mm-hmm.
She begins to adopt a self-denial understanding of what it means to follow God.
Mm-hmm.
And she gets a vision. She sings a song, Magnificat. She gets to be with Joseph when Simeon sings his amazing words in Luke chapter 2, and probably know about Anna as well. She gets to see Jesus at 12, dazzling the temple authorities with his knowledge. So she grows up with this. But it's then when Jesus goes public and he begins to experience all this resistance and opposition, and he starts saying crazy things, and he starts predicting things that they were not expecting, and he starts marching toward Jerusalem with some kind of courage that looked like he's willing to die for this, that she's saying, this is not the script for a Messiah. And yet she is there at the cross with two other women named Mary, very common. I think it's about 40% of women in the first century had the name Miriam from the Maccabean era, Hasmonean era. So here she is. She is at the cross. She is with Jesus as followers at Pentecost. So she becomes the paradigm of the Jew who had to struggle. She resisted Jesus time after time. She had to struggle to embrace the true script for Jesus. And she shows all Christians that we are going to encounter in our life script interruptions that we're not going to like, but they might be the way God has planned for us. And so Beverly Gaventa is the one who wrote about on this that I think I first read about Mary as the prototypical disciple. I think she is every bit as robust in her faith and struggle as Peter was.
Yeah.
Peter says, you'll never die. That's not what Messiah is. That's what Mary's doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate that we always tell the story of Peter and we laugh. We get a good laugh at his expense for sticking his foot in his mouth all the time. But Mary is the one who struggles this privately, more quietly, but she's the one who's at the cross. She's there. She beats Peter to embracing the crucified Messiah. So she's the paradigm. I think you're right.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so glad you wrote it. It's a very helpful look at the person of Mary, and then what we're missing when we miss not just Mary, but all the other women, and we erase them from Scripture. So, thanks for doing that. Thanks for your wisdom, and then also thanks for the way that you're modeling this.
Well,
the way that you're working intentionally. It matters to us.
But people like you, Danielle, are the ones making it happen. I tell my students all the time, if you want to change your church about women leaders, you have to have women who can utter words that males say, that was helpful to me. And I say, I want you to be good. I mean, you don't have to be the best, but women know they're in a men's competition and they have to be better in some ways. They work hard. But I think that we need women examples like you who are leading that can say to my granddaughter, there's no problem with you if you want to go into church ministry. Women can be church leaders. So I want to thank you.
Oh, thanks, Scott. Thank you. Guys, thanks for this. This is The Right Side Up. Scott is so prolific. You can get tons of his books everywhere. Just honestly, you could Google him or go to his website. He writes on Substack. I subscribe to that and am blessed by it all the time. So check out his stuff. And we're glad you're with us on this journey. We have Need to Know. We would love for you to get it. We'd love for you to read it. And we'd love for you to buy a case of it and give it to every male leader that you know. Because there's some stuff they need to know. And this is just one. Thanks again.
Thank you.